Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this important and timely discussion as we approach Holocaust Remembrance Day. My name is Samuel Holliday, and I have the tremendous privilege of serving as Director of Operations and Director of Scholarship for the United States Capitol Historical Society. And we're grateful that so many of you are taking time out of your busy day to join us as we explore this important chapter of American and world history. Before we get into our fantastic program today with our wonderful speaker, I'd like to do a little bit of technical housekeeping. As we've worked in the Zoom platform to reach you nationwide and in some cases worldwide, we love to interact through the question and answer session at the end of each of our programs. And so if you have any questions for Dr. Erbelding throughout the course of today's program, you can submit those into the Q&A section of the webinar. That looks like two speech bubbles either at the top or bottom of your screen, depending on what device you're using to join us today. Now, if you have any technical troubleshooting matters, if you think you need help, if you're not seeing us or hearing us properly, you can put those sorts of things into the chat, which I will answer in real time. But again, any content questions for our fantastic scholar will go into that Q&A section of the webinar so Jane can read them and pose them at the end of the program. It's now also my great pleasure to introduce the President and CEO of the United States Capitol Historical Society, Jane Campbell, who will introduce our speaker and start today's program. Jane?
Thank you, Sam. And thank you, as always, for all that you and Yanni do on the back end to secure the right speakers, to make sure that the platform is done and that the promotion is there, and so that people are able to join us. We really appreciate your work and know that you will be behind the scenes throughout the hour. So here we are today to discuss what really is the greatest crime in world history, the Holocaust. We often do not know that there is one United States agency that did fight to try to save the Jews from Nazi terrorism. Today, the Capitol Historical Society is pleased to host a special webinar to recognize International Holocaust Remembrance Day. During our event, we will share the remarkable yet largely unknown story of Roosevelt's War Refugee Board, the only time in United States history that the government funded an agency to save the lives of non-Americans who were being murdered by a wartime enemy. And yet, despite the heroic response of the War Refugee Board, its first director conceded that its efforts were little and late compared to the Holocaust murder of 6 million Jewish people and millions of others. Dr. Rebecca Erbelding is our featured guest to discuss the haunting lessons that are still relevant today in Holocaust history. Dr. Rebecca Erbelding, right? Erbelding,
yeah.
Erbelding. We're going to get it down.
No worries.
And then she told me I could call her Rebecca during the
Q&A. Just call me Rebecca.
When I learned Dr. Erbelding.
It's fine.
Has authored the subject's authoritative history, which you can see with the prop here, Rescue Board, the Untold Story of America's Effort to Save the Jews of Europe. She's a historian, an educator, a curator, and an archivist at the Holocaust Museum. She recently served as a historical advisor and an on-camera expert in Ken Burns's documentary, The U.S. and the Holocaust. As part of her work, she's given presentations on Anne Frank, the Holocaust-era diaries, U.S. immigration policy during the 1930s, as well as the Hoker album, which depicts Nazi life at Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp. Her book on the War Refugee Board won the 2018 National Jewish Book Award for writing based on archival material. And so it is my honor and privilege to present to you Dr. Rebecca Erbelding. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me. This is really a tremendous honor to be here with you. I just, as I'm sharing my screen, want to note that many of you, I assume, work for the government. And so you will be used to these caveats that although I work for the USHMM, the work I'm going to talk about today is my own work and does not necessarily represent the views of the Holocaust Museum. You can see here the cover of my book. And I think this subtitle, especially in 2018, before the US and the Holocaust, the film by Ken Burns, Lynn Novick, and Sarah Botstein came out. I think the subtitle really surprised a lot of people, this idea that, one, that there were untold stories about the Holocaust, and two, that America made any sort of effort to save the Jews of Europe. I think as a country, we often have a very simplistic understanding of the US and the Holocaust. There's this impression that either the American people knew everything about what was happening in Europe and didn't do anything about it, or we knew absolutely nothing about what was happening in Europe during the war, that liberation was a total surprise and the first time that Americans learned anything about the Holocaust. And of course, both of those things are wrong. The truth is in between. History is more complicated than any of that, and neither of those are accurate. In reality, Americans had quite a lot of information about what was happening in Europe from the beginning. I apologize for this kind of fuzzy thing, but I wanted to give you a range of newspaper examples. So this is the Washington Herald. This is April 1st, 1933. And you can see a main headline: Germans limit boycott to today, reaction of world to be studied. Even in the spring of 1933, as Roosevelt is inaugurated March 4th, 1933, the beginning of the New Deal, you can see also in this headline the end of prohibition and the beginning of beer sales in the US. The first 100 days, the depths of the Depression. This is at a point when 25% of the American workforce is unemployed. Headline news in the spring of 1933 is about book burning in Nazi Germany, the boycott of Jewish-owned businesses, Jews being kicked out of the civil service. It is common to see it, and common to see it across the country, not just in Washington or New York. There are petitions that come in the spring of 1933 to senators and congresspeople, to the White House, to the State Department, from at least 500 organizations throughout the US, protesting what the Nazis are doing and asking the US to do more. Here is an example. Again, I apologize, my slides will get less fuzzy as we go. This is the Student Association from Washington Talmud Torah. And I tried to find last night as I was putting this together where Talmud Torah is and was. And there were a bunch of Talmud Torah's organizations and congregations in the DC area at various points, but I couldn't find this exact one until I looked at the address. The address, 1529 16th Street, is the Jewish Community Center now. It is where Theater J is. And so that has been a Jewish communal space for a long time, and that is clearly where this student association was located. And you can see here, again, it'll get less fuzzy from here on, but it says, "Dear Mr. President, we, the Student Association of the Washington Talmud Torah, ranging in age from 5 to 15 years old, respectfully address ourselves to you in a very serious matter. The Hitler government seems to have made up its mind to reduce our brother Jews in Germany to starvation and slavery and force them to suicide." This is in the spring of 1933. This is March 31st, 1933. Hitler has been in power in Germany for 2 months. And the students here, young people, are paying attention to the news and are asking their government to intervene. There are petitions and marches throughout the United States in the spring of 1933 in at least 65 cities, including the largest protest march in New York City history up to that point, which was dated to the day that the Nazis were burning books in Germany, because there was enough newspaper reporting that Americans knew in advance that that was going to happen. The challenge with all of this is that by the summer of 1933, this story had fallen off the front pages of American newspapers. Americans largely stopped paying attention to in most of the 1930s to what was happening to Jews in Germany. They start to pay attention again at Kristallnacht. Kristallnacht, it is headline news for about 3 weeks, the attack on Jewish businesses and burning of synagogues, an attack on Jewish men and boys throughout German-controlled territory in November 1938. You can see here again the Washington Post now. You can see, if you look to the left, that Kristallnacht happened only a few days after the midterm elections of 1938 and largely displaces the midterms as a news story. The bigger headline is "Nazis pillaging Jews as nation riots." and the smaller headline is the conclusion of 2 close Senate races. This is also the 20th anniversary of the end of World War I. And so you see a quote from John Pershing about the armistice and Armistice Day, which is now our Veterans Day. And so there's a lot going on this day. And the biggest headline is what is happening to Jews in Germany. And it will stay the biggest headline in American newspapers for about 3 weeks. This launches a refugee crisis. Hundreds of thousands of people are applying to immigrate to the US. The US has no refugee policy to speak of, so everyone is trying to come as an immigrant. We are using the same immigration law from 1924, the Johnson-Reed Immigration Act, that will stay in place until 1965 and set quotas based on country of origin over how many immigrants could come to the United States at any given time. The American people are sympathetic to what is happening to Jews, and they are not interested in extending immigration. So you can see these 2 polls, both from the end of November 1938. Do you approve or disapprove of the Nazi treatment of Jews in Germany? 94% of Americans disapprove. And then the same people are asked, should we allow a larger number of Jewish exiles from Germany to come to the US to live? And 72% say no. So the refugee crisis continues. 1941, Nazi Germany forces all US consulates to close in occupied territory. So the refugee crisis really lasts from the German takeover of Austria in 1938 to the summer of 1941, when US consulates close, and poor refugees who are desperately trying to escape now no longer have a place to go for an immigration visa. And this is the moment when American journalists are leaving Nazi territory. It is no longer safe for them to be there. They don't have diplomatic protection. And so just as the Nazis are invading the Soviet Union and mass shootings are beginning in Eastern Europe, there are fewer and fewer boots on the ground, Americans witnessing these events and reporting home about them. So Americans start to hear news of mass shootings, news of towns being wiped out, but that news is no longer on the front page. And it tends to be coming from sources out of the Soviet Union or sources from the Polish government in exile. And those are sources that Americans don't trust. We are still not involved in the war. And so it feels like these are organizations and governments that want to pressure us to get involved in a war that we don't want to get involved in. Even after Pearl Harbor, throughout most of 1942, headlines are about the war. They are not about what might be happening to European Jews. And this is at the time when the most number of people are being murdered. Rescue Board, though, my book is largely about what happens after this period. 1942, in the summer, Gerhart Reiner, who was a 30-year-old German lawyer who had escaped to Switzerland and was working for the World Jewish Congress organization, which was based in New York, he learned third-hand from a German businessman that all of these rumors of mass killing in the East, people who were witnessing the deportation of Jews from Western Europe to the East, all of these rumors that he was hearing in Switzerland and the things that people were witnessing, they all had a purpose. And the purpose was the Nazis had a plan to round up and murder all of the Jews of Europe. Obviously, this seems really clear to us now. The Holocaust is a topic in which hindsight is really hard to escape. But back then, they saw no precedent to this. They thought Jews had been subjected to pogroms before. It didn't make sense to them that the Nazis would be engaging in this kind of effort while they're simultaneously trying to win a war. Reiner, though, believes what he has heard. And so he tries to send his news to the US via the US consulate, which had the only secure communications channel to the United States out from Switzerland. And in Washington, State Department officials block the message. One says, it seems too fantastic to be true. And another says, this is just a war rumor. There's no sense in getting people riled up about this. And another says, I just can't see why you would put this thing in a telegram. But the news that the Nazis had this plan eventually made it out. And by November 1942, the press reports the story. You can see that these are very small articles appearing not always on the front page of the paper. But it's happening. You can see the two articles, the one on the middle and the one on the left, are about Stephen Wise, the most famous rabbi in America, announcing to the press that at least 2 million Jews had been killed. In December 1942, the United States, the Soviets, the British, and a number of nations in exile release a statement. They say, we condemn this cold-blooded policy, or this policy of cold-blooded extermination. And so the US condemns it, and the US says, after the war, we will have war crimes trials. There is no promise of rescue. This is only a month after the Allies had landed in North Africa. So Allied troops are thousands of miles away from the killing centers, which is where we know most people are being murdered at this time. But for more than a year after this, for all of 1943, this information is in the press. It is treated as credible. There's more and more information coming out, and there's more and more pressure on the government to do something about it. The State Department spends the year kind of trying to quash that public pressure, arguing that they've already done enough, that there's nothing more that the United States can do to help Jews in Europe. Activists are staging elaborate rallies and stage shows. This is an Orthodox Rabbis March on Washington in October 1943. They are putting in full-page newspaper ads condemning the Roosevelt administration, condemning the State Department for their inaction. In 1943, mass rescue is largely impossible. The Allies only have a tenuous grasp on the European continent. They've now invaded Italy, but certainly more could have been done in 1943. And at this point in the story, a group of Treasury Department lawyers enter the picture, very unlikely heroes. Most of them were in their 30s. Nobody in my story is really older than 38. And they had spent the fall of 1943 really getting frustrated by the State Department, frustrated that the State Department was delaying humanitarian aid that they had decided could enter Europe through the economic sanctions that we had in place, the very rudimentary economic sanctions. And it was not a lot of money that these organizations wanted to send, $25,000 to help Jews in France and Romania. And yet the State Department is delaying this by months and months and months. And so the Treasury Department gets incredibly frustrated, and they start to investigate why the State Department is delaying humanitarian aid for Europe. And they discover in the process of this investigation evidence that the State Department was actively also trying to stop information about the Holocaust from reaching the United States, specifically any more of Gerhart Reiner's reports about atrocities. One of the best things about studying the Treasury Department is that Henry Morgenthau Jr. was FDR's Treasury Secretary. He was not a very good money guy. He did not have a college education. He was one of Roosevelt's closest friends, which is how he got this gig. But he was an incredible manager, and he recognized talent. And he was a great record keeper. And so you can go online now and you can read transcripts of his meetings. It is one of the best resources that we have to learn about the inner workings of the Roosevelt administration, or what are called the Morgenthau diaries. And so in the book, I was actually able to quote people in meetings because I have the transcripts of those meetings. And at the end of December 1943, Josiah Du Bois, who was one of the lawyers at Treasury, said, "Mr. Secretary, the only question we have in our mind, I think, is the bull has to be taken by the horns in dealing with this Jewish issue and get this thing out of the State Department into some agency's hands that's willing to deal with it frontally. For instance, take the complaint, what are we going to do with the Jews? We let them die because we don't know what to do with them." And then Randolph Paul, who was the Treasury Department's general counsel, said, "We are speaking as citizens now." And I always found that incredibly powerful. This idea that the Treasury Department's general counsel is in the meeting with his boss, the secretary, and saying, this isn't a policy position that we necessarily politically think you should take, but we are citizens of a democracy, and we think our country is better than what the State Department is doing. And so, armed with all of this evidence, the Treasury Department wrote a new memo. This is a draft of the original. It is entitled Personal Report to the President on the Acquiescence of This Government in the Murder of the Jewish Population of Europe. And it began, "One of the greatest crimes in history, the slaughter of the Jewish people in Europe, is continuing unabated. Unless remedial steps of a drastic nature are taken and taken immediately, I am certain that no effective action will be taken by this government to prevent the complete extermination of the Jews in German-controlled Europe, and that this government will have to share for all time responsibility for the extermination." It was time to go to Roosevelt and demand, as one of the Treasury staff put it, a New Deal. And so on January 16th, 1944, Morgenthau and two members of his staff go to the White House and they meet with Roosevelt, and they convince him to issue an executive order establishing the War Refugee Board, which was a new government agency tasked with the relief and rescue of Jews and other persecuted minorities. It was officially headed by the Secretaries of War, State, and Treasury, but it was unofficially a complete Treasury Department operation. It was housed at Treasury. Almost the entire staff were Treasury personnel, with 35-year-old John Paley, who was an assistant to the Treasury Secretary, as the War Refugee Board's director. So Paley had been in charge of what was called Foreign Funds Control, which was the US's rudimentary economic sanctions wing. It is now OFAC. And he was in charge of controlling about $8 billion in frozen and seized assets owned by Nazi Germany and the countries that it and Japan had overrun. And so this is a man who had had a very serious job and leaves that job to come over and to become the new head of the War Refugee Board. And so for the first time, the US has a policy about the Holocaust. It is a policy of rescue and relief. And by the time the war in Europe ends 17 months later, the War Refugee Board has undoubtedly saved thousands of lives. They try so many different ideas and had projects in dozens of countries that it's really hard to explain everything that they did in a very pithy summary. And so I'm just going to give you a couple of examples and hope that you pick up my book either at a bookstore or library to learn the rest. So the same day in January 1944 that Roosevelt issues this executive order creating the War Refugee Board, the staff, and you can see Paley here and two of his staff members, they streamlined the process that relief agencies were using to send money into Europe. They argued that it no longer mattered if this humanitarian aid money fell into the hands of the Nazis in light of this humanitarian crisis, that the humanitarian crisis was so big and the war was going well enough that even if the Nazis took this money, it was not going to change the course of the war. And so by the end of World War II, the War Refugee Board had authorized about $11 million, which is about $170 million today, on behalf of a whole host of different aid organizations. And this money was used to buy guns for the French underground. It was used to pay off border guards. It was used to feed children who were in hiding. It was used to create false papers. It was used for a whole host of things. The board also appointed representatives in most of the neutral nations in Europe, in Turkey, in Switzerland, in Sweden, in Portugal. They had somebody in North Africa. They had somebody eventually in London. They tried and couldn't get somebody into Spain. Most of these people were Treasury Department staff members or aid workers, although their representative in Turkey was a narcissistic Bloomingdale's marketing executive who happened to be going to Turkey and decided he wanted to go as a diplomat and ended up getting about 8,000 Jews out of Romania and Bulgaria and into Palestine, what is now the state of Israel, in 1944. And so these representatives are doing a lot of things. They are trying to leverage the now near certain Allied victory to convince neutral nations that now is the time to be on the side of the United States, to allow more refugees over their borders, to protest what the Nazis are doing to Jews, and to provide this agency, the War Refugee Board, with intelligence about what they are seeing inside Nazi territory. So from Washington, John Paley lays out his strategy. His strategy is to persuade the Nazis and their collaborators to stop the killing and to take action to rescue those who could still be saved, either by moving people who are on the margins of Nazi territory into areas of safety, or for people deep inside Nazi territory in Hungary and Poland, to keep them alive as long as possible, to keep them alive, hopefully long enough for the Allied army to come and liberate them. So I'm going to give you an example of each of these kind of strategies. So the first is that the board launched a propaganda warfare campaign using radio broadcasts and leaflets. They targeted would-be perpetrators, promising that if they continued or if they began harming people, that they would be brought to justice at the end of the war. And on March 24th, FDR issued a statement that was drafted by the War Refugee Board. And you can see the statement was sent over the radio into Nazi territory, and it was dropped from planes. This is one of the leaflets that was dropped from a plane. And so he said, the report, I said, was drafted by the War Refugee Board, and it echoes some of the language that they had pitched to him back in January. Quote, in one of the blackest crimes of all history, begun by the Nazis in the day of peace and multiplied by them 100 times in time of war, The wholesale systematic murder of the Jews of Europe goes on unabated every hour. So this is March 24th, 1944, and only a few days earlier, Nazi Germany had invaded Hungary. Hungary was the largest and last intact, largely intact, Jewish population in Europe. And so the War Refugee Board was incredibly concerned about what was about to happen in Hungary, and they quickly added a new paragraph to Roosevelt's statement that read, "As a result of the events of the last few days, hundreds of thousands of Jews who, while living under persecution, had at least found a haven from death in Hungary and the Balkans, are now threatened with annihilation. That these innocent people should perish on the very eve of triumph would be a major tragedy." It is impossible, of course, to measure the effects of psychological warfare. We can't kind of say this saved these many people because the perpetrators decided not to murder them. But I actually discovered this leaflet, this particular one, because I was talking to an elderly German man who had been a teenager at the time and remembered finding this leaflet with Roosevelt's statement after a bombing raid over his town in April 1944. And American propaganda was very smart. They would have this warning on one side, and then on the back side, they would have something about recent bombing raids in the area. So you on the ground would know, well, I do know that that factory was hit because I'm living here. I see that. And so he says that he knew that those things were true. And also, this is the moment that he realized what was happening in his country. So the War Refugee Board and the US government, through the War Refugee Board, also laundered money to help refugees sneak into Sweden. The sanctions people at Treasury might quibble with me about the use of the term money laundering, but I'm going to let you all decide because I definitely think it was money laundering. So the War Refugee Board's representative, who you can see here, was named Ivor Olson. And he served as the Stockholm legation's financial attaché, which sounds to me like a very boring job, but he was also an OSS spy. The OSS, the precursor to the CIA, his code name was Crispin, and he was tasked with the monitoring the movement of money and war material between Sweden and Nazi Germany. It does not seem clear that his Treasury Department colleagues knew that he had this other gig. And so when they asked him to be the War Refugee Board's representative in Sweden, he tacks his third full-time job onto his plate. So he has a spy job, his cover job, and now his War Refugee Board humanitarian aid job. Among all of the other things that he is doing, he is the man who's responsible for recruiting Raoul Wallenberg, the now famous Swedish businessman who traveled to Budapest, funded by the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee and selected by the War Refugee Board. As I said, the War Refugee Board was incredibly worried about what was happening in Hungary and approached all of the neutral countries to say, can you pass on intelligence about what your diplomats are seeing? Can you protest any sort of violence against Jews in Hungary? And will you increase your diplomatic representation there so that people could spread about the country and serve either as a deterrent to violence or as a witness to it? And Sweden is the country that said yes and said, you choose who you want to send. And so Raoul Wallenberg, in letters to the War Refugee Board, says that he believed that he was doing, quote, an American job. So Wallenberg established safe houses and issued letters of protection and saved the lives of thousands of Jews in Budapest. That is not the money laundering story, though. That is actually the side story. For much of the summer of 1933, Olson is focused on a plan to rescue refugees from Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia by water. He said that he would need, quote, the most skillfully organized type of underground operations because the Baltic countries are now virtually sealed to everything. But he thought if he could get the money, he could rescue 600 or 700 intellectual, racial, or political refugees from each of those countries. He needed the money for basically speedboats and guns. Speedboats to go across the North Sea, land on the beaches, file people onto the boats, and then get back to the islands off the coast of Sweden. The War Refugee Board paid for this project directly out of funds from President Roosevelt. They had a bank of secret fund that they could use without having to report what they were doing with it. But a large deposit in a Swedish bank, large enough to buy all of this stuff, would be really suspicious. And the War Refugee Board wanted to avoid any impression that the US was funding unregulated refugee entry into a friendly nation. And so even Swedish Jews, Olson told them, quote, are very interested in Jewish rescue and relief operations so long as they do not involve bringing them into Sweden. So John Paley, who in his treasury work, working with foreign funds control, working with sanctions, his job had been to stop American companies from secretly sending money overseas, decides that he is going to use those tools to sneak the War Refugee Board's money past the Swedish government and past the Swedish people. And so at Paley's urging, staff of Goodyear Tire in Akron, Ohio, the Goodyear Tire headquarters, no doubt astonished that the US government is making this request, agreed that if the War Refugee Board transferred $50,000 to their headquarters in Akron, their factory in Norrköping, Sweden, would give $50,000 worth of Swedish kroner to Ivor Olson. There are no references to the Goodyear Tire deal in any of the War Refugee Board's papers, save for a mysterious $50,000 entry in their financial ledger. It is pretty clear that those records got scrubbed. But as I said, Henry Morgenthau, the Secretary of the Treasury, was an excellent record keeper. He received copies of much of the War Refugee Board's correspondence every day, and they forgot to purge his records. And so when I was trying to figure out why there was this Goodyear Tire $50,000 deal that was not referenced anywhere in any of the 120 boxes I was looking at, I started going through the Morgenthau papers and found this cable where Olson reports on June 7th, 1944, this arrangement worked well, and although not foolproof, it is desirable from a security point of view. At this time, we do not recommend bank transfers, as receipt of cable transfers of such size by individuals involved in operations unavoidably attract notice and suspicion. So Olson is able to get the money. He is able to buy the boats and guns. It is a very rocky start. Some of the boats capsize, some are captured by the Swedes, some are captured by the Nazis, and he manages to get out about 4,000 people. As far as we know, none of them were Jewish, in part because the Jewish communities of these countries were largely gone. And those who remained were deep in hiding and very nervous about the idea of going to a beach openly, trying to get on a boat and then trying to make it to Sweden when they were about to be liberated by the Red Army. And so it seems fairly clear that a lot of the people who are escaping not just the Nazis, but escaping the Soviets. But this is a real effort that the War Refugee Board was trying to make. And the Treasury Department staff, who had been spending most of the war trying to keep the money out of the hands of the enemy, this is a clear example of their feeling that humanitarian aid was more important than adhering to the rules. In Switzerland, which was completely surrounded by enemy territory and had been since the fall of 1942, the War Refugee Board had to find somebody who was already on the inside. Roswell McClelland, an aid worker with the American Friends Service Committee, the Quakers, had been working in Europe since 1940. He and his wife had run the Quaker Aid Organization in Rome, helping refugees try to get their paperwork together to then go to the consulate and hopefully get their visa. And when Italy kicked them out basically in 1940, in 1941, when the consulates closed, they moved on to southern France. Southern France was unoccupied. It was aligned to Germany, but the US still had diplomatic relations with southern France until November 1942. And so McClelland and his wife were actually working inside French internment camps, inside Gurs and Les Milles, trying to help refugees get their paperwork together, trying to distribute aid. Ross's wife, Marjorie, was actually in charge of selecting children for children's transports to the United States, the transports of unaccompanied children. And they were even influential in trying to secret children out of these camps to get them into orphanages or to get them into hiding situations. In 1942, at the end of the year, they snuck across the border into Switzerland to run the Quaker Aid Organization out of Bern. And so they, their comrades, the other Quakers who were still in southern France, were all rounded up and arrested in November 1942 and not traded as part of a prisoner exchange until 1944. But Ross and Marjorie had gotten lucky. They had crossed the border. He was in place. He knew a lot of people. As part of his long history of aid work at this point. And so a lot of his work involves people deep inside Nazi territory, and a lot of these chains going out into Hungary, into Poland. And among a myriad of other things, he is actually involved in ransom negotiations with the Nazis. The Nazis are trying to use America's newfound interest in refugees to their advantage. And so they offer, frankly, Jews for sale. The US is never going to agree to pay ransom, but McClelland and Sally Meyer, who is the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee's aid worker in Switzerland, representative in Switzerland, they managed to string along a group of high-ranking Nazis for about 6 months. In November 1942, without telling the War Refugee Board, and actually never telling the War Refugee Board that he had done this, Ross McClelland actually secretly travels to Zurich and met SS Obersturmbannführer Kurt Becker, a man who reported directly to Adolf Eichmann. He was dressed in his SS uniform, and Ross pretended, again, he's 30 years old, pretended to be Roosevelt's personal emissary to negotiate ransom for the fate of the remaining Jews of Europe. And so this is a very real effort. This is their effort is one of the reasons that many of the Jews of Budapest survive, is because there were active ransom negotiations going on for their fate, and they were being held in Switzerland by a 30-year-old American aid worker. Beyond all of this, the War Refugee Board opens a refugee camp in the United States, in upstate New York at Fort Ontario in Oswego, New York, right on the banks of Lake Ontario. And they brought nearly 1,000 mostly Jewish refugees to live there. They argued that the Nazis, quote, must not be given the pretense of justification that the Allies, while speaking in horrified terms of the Nazi treatment of Jews, never once offered to receive them. And this was also a problem with our neutral countries. We were pressuring them to open their borders, and they were turning around and saying, well, why isn't the US bringing people in? And so the United States opened this refugee camp, this emergency refugee shelter outside of immigration law, and brought about 1,000 people to live there. They were surrounded by barbed wire, and they lived there until the winter of 1946. So more than 8 months after the end of World War II in Europe, because there were a lot of discussions and negotiations over whether they should be returned to Europe. The War Refugee Board also sent about 300,000 food packages into concentration camps in the final weeks of the war. You can see here a man holding a Red Cross food package. We know that most of the Red Cross food packages that are distributed inside concentration camps in March, April, and May 1945 were actually packaged off Long Island, taken to Sweden or to southern France, disguised there as Red Cross packages, and delivered by the Red Cross into these camps, fully funded by the United States. The board also passed along requests to the War Department to bomb the rail lines, the gas chambers, and the crematoria leading to Auschwitz, or to wipe the entire camp off the face of the earth. And they gave detailed information to the American people about what was happening at Auschwitz. This was a report that they received in its entirety finally in October 1944, and immediately decided to release it to the press. When the War Department was not interested in putting it in Yank magazine, which was the soldiers' magazine, and asked for a story that was less Semitic, the War Refugee Board distributed it without asking anyone in the government to 200 newspapers nationwide. They had an embargo, and so Thanksgiving weekend 1944, articles like this one appeared throughout the United States. This is the Louisville Courier, and you can see that they're using very small font and long paragraphs to try to get as much information as possible for their readership about what was happening in Auschwitz, the process, very detailed, very graphic process of arrival and selection and gassing. And you can see that they've even included one of the diagrams from the report, which shows how Zyklon B was put into the different gas chambers. As a response to this report, and as a response to the American people learning for the first time about this, the Washington Post issued an editorial entitled genocide. This was a new word. This word had just recently been coined by Raphael Lemkin, who was a Polish Jewish jurist and legal scholar who had been trying to figure out a word for this new kind of crime. And he came up with, during World War II, the word genocide. And the Washington Post, this is one of the first times that word is used in an American newspaper. And the Post says, this is a new word. The War Refugee Board has introduced us to a new kind of crime. And so Americans need to learn this word. I don't have time to get into all of the other things that the War Refugee Board is doing, including how they saved the lives of the parents of Zsa Gabor. And so I hope, and a time that is now completely forgotten now, when we offered to evacuate all of the Jews of Hungary, should the Nazis allow them to leave. So I hope you do pick up the book or watch the documentary, The U.S. and the Holocaust, to learn a little bit more about some of the things that they were doing. So in conclusion, before we get to questions, the War Refugee Board's creation was and remains the only time in U.S. history that the U.S. government tried to do this, that we founded a government agency dedicated to saving the lives of the victims of our wartime enemy. And so the 21 months that it existed between January 1944 and September 1945, when it shut down, represent this moment in American history where our action is matching our rhetoric about our democratic values. And in contrast to a lot of subsequent human rights efforts, there's no secondary motive. This is not about a larger program to gain overseas prestige and power. It is not about political favor or influence over a minority group. The refugees who are in peril, who are being helped by the War Refugee Board, almost all of them had no idea where this money was coming from, where this aid was coming from, any idea that the US had any interest in their survival. And so historian Yehuda Bauer, who's a historian emeritus at Yad Vashem, Israel's Holocaust Memorial and Museum, wrote once, quote, "What made the WRB, the War Refugee Board, such a unique body is that it was officially permitted to break practically every important law of a nation at war in the name of wartime humanity. In the name of outraged humanity." And so I kind of hope that the War Refugee Board will start to enter our public narrative about American responses to the Holocaust, because I think it is very relevant history. The War Refugee Board debated many of the challenges that still face us today. They discussed how to bring people into the United States when there are very real national security concerns. They debated the role of ransom negotiations with an enemy. They debated the push and pull between, do you provide relief for a lot of people, food and clothing and things, or do you try to physically rescue a few people? How many resources we can risk falling into the hands of the enemy. These were all things that they were debating and saying, we are going to move forward anyway. We are going to put these guardrails up and we are going to move forward. They prioritized action. And so while the United States could have done much more to aid Jews and other Nazi victims, especially in the 1930s, before killing began, what the War Refugee Board staff did mattered. And I think it's important to remember that, both to honor their efforts, to bring greater nuance into our understanding of American responses, and also to study their work as we continue to confront challenges today. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen and hope that you will put any questions you have in the chat, and we can have a conversation. So thanks so much.
Wow. Well, Dr. Erbelding, what a great story, an important story. And it is indeed one that has not been widely told. And we're grateful to have a moment to share that. So a couple questions emerge, and we invite you, listeners, to continue to look, add your questions. What was the role of Congress during all of this? Did they know? Did they care? Were they, what were they doing?
Well, Congress in the 1930s is incredibly anti-immigration. It reflects really the tenor of the country. The American people are not, poll after poll show that they are not interested in having their member of Congress do anything to change the immigration laws. And as I said, that is the moment in which the most people could have probably been aided. is by doing anything to change our immigration laws, to open up to people who could be here temporarily for the emergency, some sort of quasi temporary protective status, or even a refugee status, which didn't exist at the time. During the war, largely they're disinterested. There are a few who are great. Emmanuel Seller out of New York is just consistently trying to fight for his constituents, which largely were Jewish immigrants. And so he is constantly trying to get people on board. There are a number of senators and congressmen who are affiliated with the Emergency Committee to Save the Jews of Europe, which was the agency or the committee in 1943 that's really pushing the US government to do more, saying, don't you see what's happening? Like, let's put out our newspaper ads, let's stage these. They're the ones who staged the Orthodox March on Washington. And so there are a number of congressmen who are involved in that committee and end up putting in their own proposal in November 1943 to encourage Roosevelt to create some sort of commission. That's something that I didn't mention in the talk that I do get into in the book, is this commission that Congress is kind of pushing the Roosevelt administration to do. It gets hauled up in hearings in the House. It passes the Senate, but never makes it to the floor for a vote before Roosevelt creates the War Refugee Board. And so there are people who are sympathetic, but a lot of the complaints that you hear are very similar to complaints you hear in Congress today. People saying, well, they're going to take jobs. Well, we don't know what will happen to them. Well, there'll be pressure for more people after that. You see that play out in the discussion over whether to allow the refugees at the refugee camp in Oswego to stay. Congressmen saying these are people who are not going to assimilate with us. They're going to take jobs. We now need jobs for the soldiers who are coming back. These are not the right sort of people, which is, of course, anti-Semitic. And so I don't think there is this big turn in which Congress is suddenly sympathetic to the plight of Jews, even though we have all of this new information about what's happening.
And have you come across in your scholarship people who who heard about what was going on and either did nothing or indicated that it was just not real, who then said, whoa, I'm so sorry? Was there that kind of reckoning? Is
there a reckoning of, oh, I'm so sorry? Man, I wish there had been, right? I'm sure there are some examples, but this is also something that is going on with the American people, right? So when the US government acknowledges that this is happening at the end of 1942, there's a poll in January 1943 saying, do you believe that the Nazis have murdered 2 million people? And not quite half of Americans say yes. And so even though the government has said this is happening, Americans are very unsure about this. If you fast forward to right after the War Refugee Board releases the Auschwitz Report, that now has jumped to about 76% of Americans believe that the Nazis are murdering people. But when they're asked, how many people do you think they've murdered? A plurality is at about 200,000. So Americans, even when they start to believe that this might be happening, they can't fathom the numbers. And so what you see when you see reporting on liberation in the spring of 1945 is coming out with headlines like, now we have to believe, like now we must confront this. I don't think there's necessarily a reckoning where people say, I'm sorry, but they say, now we have evidence. It's very convenient and it's very comforting to say, oh, we didn't know before, but now we have evidence and now we believe. No, there was a lot of evidence before. We just like to think that we need this kind of overwhelming amount of photography and images and things to understand what's going on, when there was so much information. And people, I think, willfully did not want to believe that this was happening.
Now, what happened to the people who were up in the New York camp in Oswego?
there's a lot of discussion. There are congressional hearings about their fate, and teachers from the local elementary school testify, the principals testify, the American aid workers who are working with them testify to Congress about who these people are and that they'll make good citizens. For a long time, it looked like they were going to be sent back. For most of 1944, it looked like they were going to be sent home. And these are people who, many of them had lost everybody back in Europe. And had been on the run for years. Finally, on December 22nd, 1945, Truman issues what is now called the Truman Declaration. And he says that from now on, people who are displaced, so will get preference within the US immigration system, and the refugees at Fort Ontario will be allowed to stay. And so the refugees, over the course of about 6 weeks, board buses, because under US law at the time, and I don't know if it's still true now, but under the law at the time, you could not change your immigration status in the US, within US territory. And so people who come on visitors visas or tourist visas and then get stuck here have to then go to Canada or to Cuba or to Mexico to change their status. And so over the course of about 6 weeks, these refugees in waves board buses, go from Oswego, which is north and east of Syracuse, drive the very probably 4 or 5 hours to Niagara Falls, register at the US consulate, and then are finally admitted to the United States, and spread throughout the country. And, you know, one of them helped invent the CAT scan, one helped invent the Polaris missile, one helped run Zabar's in New York City. These were people who became Americans very quickly.
Were there any other Jewish refugee camps?
No, this was the only one. The War Refugee Board really pushed for many more. And this camp, Fort Ontario, was actually run by the War Relocation Authority, which was also in charge of running the camps for Japanese and Japanese Americans. This was under US law and under the US administration. These were the people who knew how to run camps for civilians. And so they bring in a lot of the people who are running the Japanese camps, then come and run this one camp for Jewish refugees. So the War Refugee Board actually wanted to use some of the Japanese camps to also house Jewish refugees. But by the time this group arrives in August 1944, there's this feeling that, you know, we're about to take Paris, this war is going to be over by Christmas. And since these people are going to go back after the war, there's no sense in establishing new camps when we would just bring them here and then turn around and send them back. And so I think they probably should have kept going. I think they definitely should have been bringing more people over. And that was what the staff really wanted to do. And that was not what the rest of the Roosevelt administration wanted to do.
And what inspired you to pursue this as your scholarship?
I mean, I could go back to the very beginning. So I'm not Jewish, and I grew up in an area of upstate New York called Churchville, which is, you can tell how many synagogues might be in Churchville. And I came to the US Holocaust Memorial Museum with my Girl Scout troop when I was 12. And it was my first, we used our cookie trip to come to DC, and it was my first time here. And I was like, well, one, I'm going to live here someday. And two, I don't understand how this could have happened, and decided that I was going to figure it out. And so I went home, I read everything that I could find about the Holocaust, and I came down to the DC area for college. And I got an internship at the Holocaust Museum the summer after my junior year, and have been full-time for 20 years now this month. Got my master's and my PhD while I was at the museum. And I think one of the reasons that I came into this kind of idea of American responses is I didn't want to leave my job. And so I wanted to do something related to the Holocaust. And also I'm in DC. And so the proximity that I had to the National Archives and to other organizations to talk about American response felt really rewarding, and like that there was a lot there. And I also felt like the scholarship had kind of stagnated. There were a few people who were writing books about this, but there was this sense that this wasn't a vibrant field. And I think there's so much about American response that we just still don't know, because I can't write every book, I can't research every book. And so I'm really hoping that the exhibit at the Holocaust Museum, that the film that Ken and Lynn and Sarah made, that millions of people have now seen, will inspire younger students to say, oh, I want to learn more about that because I want to read your book and I want to sit with you on panels. Like, there's so much out there that I don't know, or that, glimpses of things that I'm curious to dive down, but there are only so many rabbit holes you can jump through. And so I'm really hoping that more people will be interested in this, because I think it really is a fascinating topic.
Absolutely. Do you know, was there ever an investigation about the State Department, misusing
the
money,
anti-Semitism,
doing these magical things?
Yeah, only by historians. So as far as I know, the State Department never investigated itself. It did write a post-war history of how the State Department worked during the war, and there is no mention of any sort of, obviously there wouldn't be, because the men who were doing this were the men who were writing this. So in their post-war history, which has never been published, it's at the National Archives, you can read it. They did a great job, according to them. Just one of the challenges of writing your own history.
Right. Now, what was Eleanor Roosevelt involved at all in the War Refugee Board? She was always sort of a voice of sorts for justice. How did she play in this?
I mean, she's so involved in the 1930s, and I knew that going into this project, that I expected to see her everywhere in this history, and I really didn't. It seems like once this agency was established, she wasn't getting involved in kind of the day-to-day operations. One thing that she does do, though, is she is the only administrative representative who visits Fort Ontario, outside of the people who worked there. She and Eleanor Morgenthau, who was one of her closest friends, Henry Morgenthau's wife, the Secretary of the Treasury, went up there in September 1944, about a month after the refugees arrived. And they toured and they talked to people. And that is still one of the most vivid memories that survivors who are at Fort Ontario have, is the day that Mrs. Roosevelt came.
And were you able to interview people who were survivors of the camp?
Yeah, I'm actually working on a project related to Fort Ontario now, and there are still at least a dozen people who were obviously all children at the time who came to Fort Ontario. I also I was the keynote at the 75th anniversary of their arrival back in 2019, and was at the 70th. And so they have anniversaries and reunions every 5 years or so up in Oswego, and I've been fortunate enough to be at the last two of them, and we'll be back in March for a conference up there that I think some of the refugees might be at as well.
Wow.
Yeah, there's a really nice museum up there. So if people are ever in the Syracuse area or happen to be in Oswego, there's a really lovely museum called the Safe Haven Museum. It's right attached to Fort Ontario, which is a New York State park, commemorating the fort, which is still intact. It's a really fascinating area and is actually under study right now by the National Park Service for potential inclusion as a national park. And if it becomes a national park, if that's something that the National Park Service recommends and Congress adopts and the Biden administration supports, that would kind of subsume Safe Haven, the museum, and we would have finally, I think, in the United States, a place to commemorate and to examine our relationship with refugee admission. Because if you think about it, there really isn't one place where we can talk about US history with refugees, since subsequent refugee populations either arrived on military bases or in airports or on beaches. There isn't this kind of one place. And I think the refugees at Fort Ontario are really some of the first refugees. They are coming outside of the immigration system for humanitarian reasons. And that's the beginning of an attempt to have something beyond just immigration.
Now, we are coming close to the end of our hour, but we had a conversation with Rebecca early on, and she said she would stay for about 10 more minutes just to continue the conversation. But we're also very sensitive to our listeners, that We promised you an hour. You've got a fabulous hour. If you want to stay for the bonus 10, please do. This has been recorded. It will be available on our website. Everyone who signed up will get a link to it with information, and also in that link will be information about Rebecca's book so that you can get the book yourself. I get to ask one last question in this basic hour. I'm a Clevelander and did some work with Goodyear. Now, was Goodyear the only company that really was involved? And how did they get selected? And I've never heard them talk about, you would think they would talk about this with some pride.
So I don't know that they know.
There's that.
My book is not a bestseller, and so I don't know that they know this. I did not approach Corporate Archive to see, because at that point there's so many countries, there's so many personalities, there's so many kind of rabbit holes even within this story that you could write 5 more dissertations, 5 more books, just taking a chunk of it and expanding on what I did. And so I hope people will do that. And I think one of the kind of largely untold stories that I actually explored as a potential second book, but then realized I'm not good at economics, is the story of foreign funds control, is the story of the birth of US economic sanctions during World War II, which is a story that is certainly clearly very relevant to today. Economic sanctions are largely the way that we wage war as a country today. That process began in April 1940 with Henry Morgenthau deciding that we were going to seize Danish and Norwegian assets right after they were invaded by Nazi Germany. And then there are executive orders and Paley gets put in charge. And I mean, it's a really interesting history of how US economic sanctions developed during World War II. And so there are corporations certainly involved in trying to get around those sanctions, in collaborating with the US government and trying to make sure that, that there's a wall between their operations in the US and any subsidiaries that are still in Europe. Obviously, it's an incredibly complicated thing to do, especially before computers. And Goodyear Tire, though, is the only one that I could find that was tasked by the War Refugee Board with participating in this way. Without their consent. So, I mean, obviously they consent eventually, but I think the hand of the Treasury Department probably influences them quite a bit. There are certainly organizations that the War Refugee Board contracts with, but that is a business agreement and a business arrangement, and was not done. That was done largely in food packages and things like that, not certainly in sneaking money overseas. That was reserved for Goodyear. And I think it was just because they happened to have a factory in Sweden. Yeah.
So we are now in our bonus time. And one of the consistent themes in the book and in the response is that the depth of anti-Semitism was very strong. Mm-hmm. And even though on the one hand, people felt like, well, this shouldn't happen, on the other hand, they're like, we don't want to take those people into our country, whether that's Sweden or the US. And it appears that we're seeing a rise again of anti-Semitism. Are there lessons that we should learn from the work of the War Refugee Board as we look at this?
There are definitely lessons to learn from the War Refugee Board, and certainly lessons to learn from the Holocaust. One is that this is where anti-Semitism leads. If we don't stand up, if we don't fight back, if we let comments slide or statements slide, if we do not speak up, stand up, this is where this can go. And so that, I think, is the foremost lesson, is understanding this history so that we can find places, when we see early warning signs, we can find places to block it now. And so one of the things that I think about is that wave of popular interest in what was happening to Jews in Germany in 1933, the protests, the marches, the rallies. How do you sustain a movement? And so we can't just stand up to anti-Semitism when there's a hate crime. We have to stand up to it every day. And that's true of all hatreds. We have to, and racism in general, we have to stand up to it every time. And we have to stand up to it when it's our friends too, saying the things or doing the things. And I think that has been a challenge, especially in the past decade or so, that there's a tendency to be so politically partisan that we will only criticize those who feel politically differently than we do. And I think that is very dangerous. I think we have to stand up to our friends too.
And let me ask a question about what is the learning for now? There's one about standing up and trying to beat back anti-Semitism even now, but is there a lesson about governmental action?
Oh, yeah. So I think the War Refugee Board did a tremendous amount. Again, John Paley later in his life said that it was little and late compared to the enormity of the Holocaust. And he's right about that. It absolutely was. But we have, and I don't know if this is a particularly American thing or a particularly human thing, we tend to think, or at least like my sense is we tend to think, if I can't fix it, there's nothing I can do. Certainly that is not correct. And the War Refugee Board, you know, the Nazis have been in power for 11 years before the War Refugee Board is created, and it still manages to do good. This is often a very long fight. And so figuring out how to sustain your movement, continuing to pressure the US government, continuing to stay involved, to keep learning, to try not to have such a short attention span, and to not feel like the fate of the world is only on your shoulders, but that you can do small things. And if a lot of us do small things, they end up being a big thing. And so that feels like a very simple answer, but I think a big challenge is trying to understand that just because it takes a long time doesn't mean it isn't still worth doing. There were people in 1944 who said, well, the war is going to be ending soon. And so what's the point of even establishing this kind of agency? And it saved tens of thousands of lives. That is not insignificant. The fact that there was enough public pressure, that there was enough finally congressional pressure on the Roosevelt administration, that they made a change. And that only happened because of all of those pressures. And those pressures come from the American people. And so there is still time for us to do more, and it is never too late for us to take action. And so that I think is both hopeful and aspirational.
Yeah, of course, we love the Girl Scout story.
Yeah.
And you're getting a lot of feedback. Everybody's running out to buy their Girl Scout cookies, hoping
that
good. The Girl Scout trip influences somebody to do good like this. But one of our persons asked if President Truman could issue an executive order basically granting the refugees who were in Oswego the privilege of moving to this country. Why has that tool never been used by President Obama, President Clinton, any of the current presidents to deal with some of the refugees who are here waiting long periods of time to get their papers?
It actually has been used in the past. It was used in Vietnam and with the so-called boat people in the late 60s and the 1970s. It was used in Cuba in the 1960s with Pedro Pan. It has been used at different times, mainly for crises and mainly for specific populations. The US actually didn't have a full-on refugee policy until the Refugee Resettlement Act of 1980. Before that, and so this is after World War II and before 1980, between those two dates, our efforts for refugees were usually bounded by location and time. And so there were efforts to allow refugees to the US in the late 1940s with the Displaced Persons Act, but that was limited to people who were inside Western, the American zone of military occupation after December 1st, 1945. And so if you were there by then, you could qualify potentially to come to the United States as a displaced person, which was outside of the immigration system. That was something that was passed by Congress. But there were efforts that Carter and Ford and Nixon and JFK and Johnson made for these kind of specific populations that would then be granted either a version of temporary protective status or given the option eventually to become a US citizen. I'm not sure if the Refugee Resettlement Act kind of changed that dynamic. I think it did. And so that's why you don't see that post 1980. You see temporary protective status, but that status can be invoked and revoked really at the based on the priorities of the executive branch. The Refugee Resettlement Act of 1980, which is what we still have in place now, really put the control over the numbers and where refugees were coming from in the hands of the executive, which means that it is at the hands of the priorities of that particular administration, where they want refugees to come from and in what numbers. And so since that passed, you see it ebb and flow, and not consistently on a Democrat and Republican basis until fairly recently. And even now, the Biden administration is not maxing out the number of refugees that it has claimed that it would like to bring. So it's still a big challenge that we have today. There's a massive refugee crisis, and not a lot of, there's public sympathy, but not a lot of will to bring people.
Rebecca, we could talk for another hour, but we're not going to do that. We have two things. One is, I think, go get the book. It's a really fascinating read. And the one question that is not going to be, wasn't Ken Burns didn't ask you on camera, and it isn't in your book, is a couple people have asked, tell us about your tattoo. What does it say?
Oh, goodness. The tattoo is unrelated. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Yeah. No, I can show it. So this is my husband. I don't know. It's very hard to show right side up. It is my husband's handwriting. It is the end of the E.E. Cummings poem, Since Feeling is First. And so it reads, laugh, leaning back in my arms, for life's not a paragraph, and death, I think, is no parentheses. And it was, as someone who lives in her head a lot, the poem is about remembering to live with your heart sometimes. And so that's the meaning behind that.
What a great joy. Well, it has been delightful to get to know you. We really appreciate the fact that you contributed your time and your talent to the Capitol Historical Society and to our members who were here. We are grateful for your work and certainly appreciative of the scholarship that is needed to address justice. Because we do this on International Holocaust Remembrance Day, because we consistently say these are stories that must be told, because this did happen. Mm-hmm. And we didn't come at it early enough or strongly enough. The encouraging thing is we did come at it, but now we must look at what is it that we must do as we look at the world in which we live, that in fact, we should understand we're all God's children. Thank you. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your listeners. We hope to see you all next time. Take care. Bye.
Thanks so much.